Hello, welcome to the audience here, also the audience at home. I'm Nick Coombe and I'm from Solway Firth Partnership, and we've been working on the Rins of Galloway Coast Path project for a number of years now, and this is one of the many activities and events that we've been running. And I'm delighted to say that this project has been very successful. The path is slowly being developed and will be ready for use in the near future. It's a project that's been led by Dumfries and Galloway Council and funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the different things you find on the Strand line and the wildlife and the odd things that you find on the beach. And one thing that was recently found in Loch Ryan is a mammoth bone, and we're very fortunate here to welcome Andrew Kitchener from the National Museum of Scotland, who's going to tell us about Ice Age fauna and hopefully reveal some of the things about the mammoth bone that was found. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Okay, thank you, Nick. So before I start, you'll hear me say the word next slide quite a lot. This isn't because I'm a playground attendant or anything. It's so that my glamorous attendant, Bruce, will be able to be my analog slide changer for this evening and make sure we're in the right place. So next slide, please. Right, so a slight health warning before we begin. I am a zoologist and not a geologist, so the first part of the talk is probably complete nonsense, but I will try and sound as plausible as possible. So next slide, please. So what we're talking about this evening are the ice ages, which is the Pleistocene epoch, which covered a period from about 2.6 million years ago until only 11,700 years ago. And everybody thinks this was a constantly cold period of time, but it wasn't. There were lots of cycles of very cold periods, but also quite temperate periods. And here we have a record of what the temperature was like in the Antarctic during the last 800,000 years. And the reason for that is that this time period is here. This is the time that woolly mammoths were on the planet. And so it gives you a kind of record of what the temperature was like when they were around. I've seen figures which have suggested, for example, on average during this period, in the summer, the temperature was about 7 degrees centigrade. And in the winter, it had been about -10. So it was pretty cold. Obviously, it got much colder than that in the particularly icy bits. So they're the troughs you see along the bottom. But there were lots of peaks and troughs as we went through this long period of time. Next slide, please. And we're going to particularly concentrate on the very last bit of that Pleistocene epoch, which is the Devensian glaciation, the last ice age. And this started about 115,000 years ago, and it ended 11,700 years ago. But just before it ended, there was this warm period called the Windermere Interstadial from about 15,000 to 13,000 years ago. And then it got colder again, which was called the Loch Lomond Readvance, or the Younger Dryas. And that lasted until 11,700 years ago. And then after that, we enter the Holocene, which is the period that we're living in now, a relatively warm period, and it's getting warmer and warmer. So if we go to the next slide, please. So at the maximum, this is when there was peak ice or peak coldness on the Earth. You can see that there was an enormous ice cap, which covered most of Britain, including virtually all of Scotland. And the only bits of Scotland that weren't covered were perhaps some mountaintops, which poked through the ice. But it was a pretty complete cover. Can we have the next slide, please? And after about 20,000 years ago, this ice gradually started to thaw out. And you can see here, this is a model showing how over time the ice cap diminishes and diminishes, but it's still pretty extensive. And you might think there's probably not much room for life in Scotland in particular. Next slide, please. And then as I said, it got colder again. So here we have the Loch Lomond Readvance, or the Younger Dryas, and you can see there's this ice cap over the west of Scotland. And if we take a section through this one to A here, next slide, you can see actually the ice was up to 860 meters thick. And you can see just here the odd mountain top which pokes through there. So it's a huge amount of ice. And that becomes significant in the story a bit later on. Next slide, please. And this is a really, if you look on the BBC website, you'll find this fantastic simulation of what this ice sheet would have looked like on Dundee, modern day Dundee. And as you can see, it's a huge wodge of ice there that was sort of pressing down on the land. Next slide, please. So what were the effects of these ice ages on the landscape? Well, because of all this water being locked up in ice caps, the sea level was much lower than it was today. It was 120 meters below what it was today, what it is today. And of course, it was much drier. So there were far fewer forests, far fewer trees around, but there were lots of deserts and grasslands. This is talking about globally, of course. And this sort of increased grasslands in particular were very important for the woolly mammoth. Next slide. And one of the major effects that we have on the landscape is glaciation. So these glaciers, which are just huge wodges of ice which are going down slopes, and they're taking with them lots of rocks and gravel and grit and so on. And so they're actually like giant pieces of sandpaper carving through the landscape. And of course, this has an immense effect on the landscape today. So have the next slide, please. So now we're going to look at what evidence we have for the ice ages today. Next slide. So once the glaciers have melted, we get this sort of classical ice age landscape. And I'm sure you remember in your school geography lessons all about these things. So you get these U-shaped valleys and various other features which have been formed by the glaciers as they've sculpted out of the landscape beneath. Next slide, please. So I say there's classic U-shaped valley here, for example, and then we have hanging valleys where you basically get waterfalls dropping off because the glaciers carved out the land. Drumlins, which is the debris that's been pushed to the end of the glacier, and you would see these here in Torridon. Erratics, these are some of the rocks which have been carried by the glaciers over large distances and just dumped in the landscape, and they look completely bizarre and out of place. And other things like eskers and roches-moutonnées, where the rocks have been scraped by the ice on one side and not on the other. As I say, I'm not a geologist, so if you're convinced by that, thank you. Next slide, please. The other thing is raised beaches, and that's a bit odd. So here we have King Craig Point in Fife, and you can see there's evidence for these other beaches at high levels. But that seems a bit curious, really, because we just said that the sea level was 120 meters lower during the last glacial maximum. But there's something else that's been happening as well. Next slide, please. Because, in particular, Scotland was down this huge ice cap. Once that melted away, Scotland started bouncing up again. So this is, and it's still happening today to some extent. So Scotland and the north of England are still rising, whereas the south of England is sinking. So I don't know whether it flips eventually, but this explains why we have these beaches that get stranded at higher levels, these raised beaches. So it's called isostatic rebound. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we want to know about is what were the habitats like back in the Ice Age, and what's the evidence for the former life there? And so we're going to describe a number of techniques whereby we can actually reconstruct what happened in the past. And one of these is pollen analysis. And so if you take a core through peat, for example, you can analyze the different kinds of pollen grains that you find at different levels. And because these have been deposited over time, you can actually date those different levels. And so you can see what plants were growing in an area at that time. And so here we have a pollen diagram for Abernethy Forest. And you can see that there was no betula, no birch here, really, no Scots pine. And around 10,000 radiocarbon years ago, these start coming in. So the trees start colonizing the landscape. So it's showing us that we're changing from a very open landscape. Obviously, before then it was all covered in ice, but once the ice melted, it was very open. And then the trees started to colonize and take over. And I mean, the important thing is that these pollen grains are very distinctive for each kind of plant, so that you can actually tell what species were growing at any particular time. So next slide. And the other kind of evidence, particularly for animal life, are fossils. And actually, Scotland's not a terribly good place for finding Ice Age fossils. And part of that is because obviously for a large part of the time it was covered in large amounts of ice. And any glaciers might have destroyed any fossil evidence anyway. But there are a few limestone caves. This is the one, this is Bone Cave near Inchdampf, and it's a very good cave site where there's a huge amount of bone has been found, thousands of reindeer antlers, for example. And this gives us a very good record of the changing fauna in Scotland from the last ice age into the Holocene. But there aren't very many places like this where we've got these remains preserved. And in fact, if you can see from this map, Scotland is covered by these very acidic soils, which is shown in red. And the acid, of course, will dissolve the bone, which is another reason why we don't see so many fossils. So, but we can find them in river and lake sediments and gravels and clay and things like that. Again, a lot of these get destroyed during extraction for industry. Next slide. So as I say, some of these have turned up when wetlands have been drained, particularly peat bogs. You'll sometimes find the fossils at the interface between the peat and the marl underneath. And also in extracting gravel or clay. So this is a skeleton of a ring seal. It's an Arctic species. It's only found inside the Arctic Circle. Polar bears eat these all the time if you've seen Frozen Planet. And this was actually found at a site where clay was being extracted for bricks at a brickworks in Fife. Next slide. And of course, the other really useful thing is to know how old things are. So we use radiocarbon dating, which is very good for dating fossils up to about 50,000 years old. And since we don't find anything older than that from the Ice Age period in Scotland, it's a very useful dating method. And it depends upon the fact that in the atmosphere, there are two forms of carbon. Carbon-12, which is the normal one, which we find in carbon dioxide. And then there's another form, which is carbon-14. It's a bit heavier. But it's only a very tiny percentage. It's that percent of the atmosphere, but it's more or less constant. It does change, but we have to assume that. And so what happens is that we get cosmic rays which zap nitrogen in the atmosphere, which forms this carbon-14, which then goes on to form carbon-14 carbon dioxide. And then that gets absorbed by plants in photosynthesis. And then animals eat the plants. And so we all have this constant proportion of carbon-14 in our bodies. But when an animal dies, because this carbon-14 is radioactive, it starts to decay. And half of it disappears every 5,730 years. So by measuring the amount of carbon-14 in the bone or in a fossil, we can work out when that animal was alive. And so the smaller amount that we find, older the fossil. And of course, when you're starting off with such a top percentage, anyway, that's why you run out of time. You can't go beyond about 50,000 years. Next slide. So let's look at the evidence for Scotland's Ice Age mammals. And Nick did say Ice Age fauna, but we don't really have much evidence except for the mammals, which is the exciting stuff anyway. So next slide. So is this what Scotland looked like? This is a diorama that we have in the Beginnings Gallery in the National Museum of Scotland. And this diorama is 13 meters long, and it shows the transition from the last ice age through to lowland oak forest and Caledonian pine forest. And here we see a couple of reindeers, a female reindeer and her youngster. Here is an Arctic fox. Here's a lemming, which is burrowing under the snow with its nest. And here's a mountain hare. So is this, what's the evidence that we have that these things were around? Next slide. Well, we do have a lot of the fossil material, and this is just a selection of some of the species that we have fossil material from. So here we have the only polar bear ever recorded in Scotland, which occurred in Bone Cave in Bear Cave. And this has been dated to about 20,000 years old. So really at the peak of the last ice age, it was wandering around on that big ice sheet. This is a brown bear, actually from shores in Dumfriesshire, and that occurred just after the end of the ice age. This is a reindeer antler, which was found in Fife, and it's about 9,400 years old. So just after the end of the ice age. And this is the jaw of a lemming, a collared lemming, which is also found up in Amsterdam. And these are the leg bones of a wild horse that was found in the Pentland Hills just south of Edinburgh. So there's a whole variety of species, some which are still extant today and others which have become totally extinct. Right, next slide, please. And then there were lots of other species that might have been here, but we don't have any evidence. And the reason why we know they might be here is because fossils have been found further south in England and Wales. But as I say, there's really exciting things like musk oxen and cave lions and wolverines, but we just don't have the evidence for that. But hopefully one day somebody will stumble across some really nice fossils in a cave. You never know. I mean, it'd be very exciting to find something like the saiga, which is this strange antelope from Central Asia, which has this highly inflatable nose, and it's a really weird thing. I've had the great privilege of stroking the nose of a saiga, and it is the most weird experience. I recommend it to you all. Next slide, please. And we do have fossils of species which are globally extinct today, which is the woolly mammoth, which I'll come to talk about later. Also the giant deer. This is the part of the skull and one antler. This was actually found in the River Cree, and so it came out of those river gravels that I was talking about. And these are the leg bones of a woolly rhinoceros, which was found in Surley in Ayrshire. And again, I'll talk a bit more about that later on. So these species, you can't find living anywhere else in the world, but the others we've talked about do occur elsewhere in the world today. But they often have obviously much more northerly distributions because they're Arctic species. Next slide, please. So some of these species have very long histories in Scotland. So from radiocarbon dating, we've looked at the antlers, or those thousands of antlers in the Amsterdam caves, and we found that they occur in these three different time periods, from 43 to 48,000 years ago, from 22 to 32,000 years ago, and about 9,800 years ago, just after the end of the last ice age. And all the antlers belong to females and a few young males, which is odd because where are the adult males? Yeah. So we looked at it and we thought, well, there is an explanation for this. The next slide, please. And that's because this valley, the Altnoir Valley near Amsterdam, was actually a traditional carving ground for reindeer. There was something about the topography of this area that even when the ice meant that they couldn't get there, they came back as soon as it thawed. And this was presumably it was a good place for good nutritional forage for them, but also it may be a good place they could look out for predators as well, like wolves. So next slide, please. And then we have lots of brown bear fossils from this locality as well. And again, they've been dated at different periods of time. So again, 46,000 years ago, similar to the band when the reindeer were around. 25,800 years ago, 11,500 years ago, and then finally a much more recent one, which is only 2,700 years ago. And this is a much more mixed group. There's adults and there's juveniles, and there's some almost complete skeletons like this one here. And then there's just odd things like the odd skull and so on, which is There's obviously a river system running through these caves, and they've been scattered about in places. But next slide, please. We've concluded that the cave system there was actually a traditional hibernation site for brown bears, and also a denning site for mothers and their cubs. So there are some bones from cubs there that were obviously being reared by the mother. And that many of these animals actually died in hibernation. And this would, particularly that skeleton that I showed you, the teeth are very worn, so it was probably a very old bear, and just was in very poor condition, couldn't get enough fat on its body to survive hibernation. Next slide, please. So when did these things become extinct? Well, taking the most recent radiocarbon dates, in Scotland, the woolly mammoth lasted to about 29,000 years ago, and the woolly rhinoceros, the one from Surley, was just under 30,000 years ago, whereas the giant deer from the River Cree was 12,400 years ago. And in Britain, it's more or less the same picture, except for the mammoth does seem to have survived along till about 14,000 years ago. But globally, if we look particularly in Russia, these animals did survive much more recently. So the woolly mammoth only became extinct 4,000 years ago. It survived on an island called Wrangel Island off the northern coast of Siberia until only 4,000 years ago. And it could be that people actually caused this extinction in a fairly modern period. The woolly rhinoceros didn't last so long. And again, the giant deer seems to have survived in the Ural Mountains of Russia until just under 8,000 years ago. And again, its extinction was probably caused by people in the end. But so some of these things did actually survive the end of the last ice age. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk a bit more about woolly mammoths in general. Next slide, please. So the woolly mammoth evolved from another mammoth in northeast Siberia, somewhere between 600,000 and 800,000 years ago. And it colonized much of the northern hemisphere, including getting into North America. And again, it's that lower sea level meant that it could cross the area from Siberia through into Alaska and colonize that part of North America. And as I said, it became extinct about 4,000 years ago. And it grew to be about 3.4 meters tall, which sounds very tall. It's not that impressive, and weighed about 6 tons. Next slide, please. In fact, most of them were about 3 meters tall at the shoulder, about 10 feet. Not all that impressive, not all that mammoth, really. This is a photograph of Jumbo the elephant, African elephant at London Zoo in the 19th century. And he was 3.35 meters at the shoulder. So he was one of the biggest elephants around. So mammoths weren't all that big. The very biggest ones got to that size, the biggest woolly mammoths. And of course, they had these huge, long, curving tusks. And the maximum recorded length is 4.2 meters on the curve. And they weighed up to 91 kilograms, which is quite a lot to carry around. Next slide, please. And you won't be too surprised to learn that mammoths occupied a unique steppe habitat across northern Eurasia called the mammoth steppe. So they had this huge distribution all the way from the Iberian Peninsula and Britain all the way across to North America. Absolutely huge. Next slide, please. But what is the mammoth steppe? What is it really like? Well, there's really nothing quite like it today. There's a few areas in Alaska and Siberia that have something similar, but it was a very calcium-rich grassland and plant habitat. It had a very diverse array of plants, and the soils were very well drained. In fact, there was often quite a lot of patchy mud in between. But these habitats today have a bit too mossy and sedgy and have too little grass in them. So they're not really quite the same, but they're roughly similar. And probably mammoths might be able to survive on if they had continued to survive until today. Next slide, please. And in order to chew up all that plant matter, you have to have big teeth. So this is a section through an elephant's tooth. And the bit of the tooth that appears above the gum is just this tiny bit at the top. So all of this is actually buried in the jaw, massive roots. And eventually over time, this tooth gets worn away and then it drops out of the front. The next slide, please. So when we chew, we tend to chew on each side, and cows, they chew from side to side. Well, elephants are very different, and mammoths, their jaws go backwards and forwards. And they're kind of like millstones rubbing against each other. And so through their lives, mammoths and elephants have 6 sets of teeth, but they appear at different times. So at any one time, they generally only have 4 teeth, to the upper jaw and to the lower jaw. But there's obviously a transition between. So they get bigger and bigger, and eventually, of course, once they've got to their last set of teeth, if they wear those out, I'm afraid they can no longer survive, because there's no chance of getting any more. So, but even so, elephants and mammoths could live a very long time, up to 50, 60 years perhaps. Next slide, please. And these teeth are made up of lots of lamellae, lots of layers of dentine and cementum. And this, because this wears at a different rate, it creates a very rough surface in which to grind up the plant matter. And this is looking at it from the top, and you can see these lamellae, these plates that make up the tooth. Next slide, please. And ancestral mammoths didn't have very many of these lamellae. And as they've evolved, they've developed more and more. And in fact, the woolly mammoth had about 3 times as many of them as the ancestral mammoth. So it had about 24 of these lamellae compared with 8 in the ancestors. And this is because its diet became, more and more of its diet became grasses, which are very abrasive and tough. They've got silica in them and they just wear away the teeth. And so woolly mammoths had even more of these lamellae in their teeth than elephants today. So their diet was particularly tough. And they were probably having to eat more anyway because of trying to keep warm in the colder climate, even though they had a woolly jumper on. Next slide, please. So how did they get there? Well, with the lower sea levels, of course, there was a land bridge connecting with Europe. And it's quite possible that there may have been even annual migrations of mammoths and other animals like reindeer and so on. So when it got too cold in the winter, they would head south, where there would be better forage, and they could carry on like that. I don't think there's any actual evidence of that, but I wouldn't have been surprised. Next slide, please. So let's talk a bit about Scotland's woolly mammoths, coming closer to home. Next slide. So mammoths have been found, or remains of mammoths have been found at 10 sites through Scotland, plus 2 other possible sites. And the best site has been Woodhill Quarry in Kilmoors, which had 9 tusks and a part of a tooth. And some of those are actually preserved, but a lot of the stuff was unfortunately thrown away. But you'll notice that at most of these sites, it's tusks or teeth that were found, and just the odd 1 or 2. And most of these, if we have the next slide, please. Most of these are occurring kind of this Midland Valley area, and they've mostly been found in clay, which is obviously a product of the Ice Age. And they've all been dated between 27,000 and 47,000 years ago. And then back in 2018, good old Nick, thank you, discovered this wonderful bone down here in Loch Ryan. And so Nick has put Stranraer on the map for the mammoth, and that's great. So next slide, please. But we're going to look at some other mammoths first. So this is one of these early mammoth tusks from Kilmoors, found in January 1817. And very helpfully, it's got a little label telling us all about its history. And so this is the most recent record of a mammoth in Scotland in terms of its radiocarbon date, only 27,000 years ago. This is since we've done a lot of conservation work on this, and it's looking a lot happier. But the problem is that these things are very fragile and they dry out and they can crumble. And so what we have to do is consolidate them, and I'll explain a bit more about that later. Next slide. The next one that was found was at Clifton Hall, just outside Edinburgh in Midlothian. And it was discovered in 1820 when they were digging the Union Canal. And some of the navvies working on the canal were told to take the tusk that was found up to the big house. So they went into Edinburgh and sold it to an ivory turner. And so he paid them for it. And the chap in the big house wasn't very happy about it. So he bought it back. But by this time, it had been cut into two. And eventually it was donated to the Free Church College. And it kind of disappeared after that. So this is the actual original article, which is describing the discovery of this mammoth tusk and the adventure that it went on after it was stolen and then recovered. Next slide, please. And this is what it looked like in the 1920s in the Free Church College Museum. This is the mammoth tusk I showed you before from Kilmore's. And this was this tusk, and you can see it was just about to be carved into something, and the end was chopped off. And after that, we don't know what happened to it. Until 1998, and somebody said, oh, I've got this bit of mammoth tusk. I think it came from somewhere, in Wester Hales or somewhere. And I thought, oh, I better know what this is. I better know it. So I went to her house, and there was this mammoth tusk, and it had this distinctive label. Next slide, please. It had a distinctive label. You can just see the remains of it there. A blue and white label, which is the Free Church College Museum label. So I knew instantly which one it was. So, but unfortunately, as you'll notice, it's rather smaller than it was in the 1920s. And that was because in the 1960s, the Free Church College Museum gave it to a man who chopped it in half and gave half to his friend, and they were going to carve it into something. But fortunately, he never got round to it. So he donated it to the City of Edinburgh Council Education Department, and it sat in a cupboard for donkey years. Oh. So it's the most amazing luck that this thing has turned up. And we still don't know where the missing piece or pieces are, because there's two missing pieces now. So if you hear of any bits of mammoth tusk floating around with distinctive blue and white labels that say Free Church College, you'll know exactly what it is. And we had that radiocarbon dated, and so that was just about 29,000 years old. Next slide, please. And we do have some other interesting mammoth tusks. These two very large mammoth tusks, they're absolutely enormous, are from Alaska, from a place called Elephant Point in Escholtz Bay. And these were amongst the first woolly mammoths ever discovered in North America back in 1826 by Captain Beechey. And again, my colleague Bethen Carrier, she did a fantastic job of conserving these, because again, you can see they're sort of flaking away here as they've dried out. So this is all consolidated now. And again, we had those radiocarbon dated, and they're nearly 47,000 years old, so a long time ago. Next slide, please. But then not every mammoth, not everything gets brought to museums is a mammoth. This donated as a mammoth back in 1916 from Berwickshire. In fact, it's elephant tooth, and it was been in some ballast that was used on the railway line, and that's where it was found. But it's just an Asian elephant tooth. So we do get a few of those. Next slide, please. So now, the moment you've all been waiting for, the Loch Ryan mammoths, more than one. Next slide, please. So this was this amazing piece of bone that Nick found on the 29th of April, 2018. And he very kindly contacted me, and we got it over to Edinburgh, and we had a look at it, and we thought it was a mammoth. So it's the femur or the thigh bone. And we compared it with our elephant skeletons, and it seems to be almost exactly the same size as a modern female Asian elephant. So it's almost certainly a female mammoth. It's had barnacles growing on it, so it was obviously been lying there for a while. And we're very grateful to Hugh Aitken, who donated it to the museum, but it meant that we can now start conserving it and also carry out some research on it. Next slide, please. And unfortunately, this has been much delayed by those dreaded COVID lockdowns. And so things stopped more or less for 2 years. But we've been able to dry it out gradually. You'll notice it has cracked a bit as that's happened. There's not much you can do about that. But it was infilled with a sort of sandy clay material. And we've noticed that that dries out at a different rate than the bone. So if we kept on letting it dry out, it would just keep on cracking. So what we've done is we've braced it, and we're going to gradually remove all of that internal clay so that it will become stable. And then we've consolidated it with a chemical to stop it flaking and cracking as well. But you'll notice we've taken a little disc bone here, and this is what we're using for radiocarbon dating and for other kinds of analyses as well. So we can look at the chemicals in that, and we can have a look at reconstructing what the diet was like in the past as well. So all of those samples are now in the queue for that radiocarbon dating, and we should hear before the end of the year what the radiocarbon date is. But I guess we're expecting something like 25 to 30,000 years old, but we'll see. Maybe it will surprise us, and you never know. Next slide, please. And the one thing we did do was carry out a technique called zooms or collagen fingerprinting. And this isn't like DNA fingerprinting where you're looking at the DNA and the base pairs in the DNA. This is looking at the protein collagen. And collagen is a very common protein. It's found in bones, it's found in our skin, it's found in tendons. And each species has a unique arrangement of amino acids. These are the chemicals that make up proteins. And it has actually confirmed, you don't understand, I don't understand this, but this tells us, very convincing, as I'm sure you'll agree with me, that this is a woolly mammoth. And of course, it could have been that we had some circus elephant or something had been dumped in the sea at some point, but no, it's definitely a woolly mammoth, and the reason why this is particularly exciting is that you'll notice from a previous slide that all the other remains of mammoth found in Scotland are teeth and tusks. So this is the first woolly mammoth bone found in Scotland. So it's really very exciting. Next slide, please. But the story doesn't end there, because early this year, George Lockyer Kirkham? You'll have to train me how to say that. Anyway, he found this half of a woolly mammoth tooth right down at the shoreline. And so this is the side of the tooth with those plates or lamellae, and this is the grinding surface of the tooth. And you'll see that there are actually some worm tubes here. So that also has been lying out there for those worms to actually colonize it. But we'll be taking samples from this on Monday, and we'll be getting this one radiocarbon dated as well. So that's 2 mammoths in 4 years, so that's pretty good. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, yes, questions, thank you.
So thank you very much, Andrew. That's been really interesting.
Good.
I'm sure there's going to be some questions, and I've got a gizmo here which apparently will let me get your voice onto the film. So has anyone any questions for Andrew? Yes, okay.
Is there any suggestion that the tooth and the bone will come from the same animal, given that we're quite close together?
Yeah, I think it's unlikely, and I think the radiocarbon date will tell us, because if they were absolutely identical, then we might be able to say that, possibly, but I would think it's unlikely. I think there's probably lots more bits of mammoth and all kinds of things out there. We just don't notice them. Yeah. So there's a sort of rallying call for you to all go out and search, because there's some nice stuff out there, I think.
Would they have been washed down? Sorry. Would they have been washed down, do you think, with Ice Age things to these points?
Well, I think it's, yeah, I think they're just washed out of the riverbanks and so on, and yeah, I think, yeah.
Any more questions? Oh yes, I reckon.
It's a question for you, Nick.
All right.
Did you realise what you'd found when you found the bone?
No, I didn't really. I knew it was big, and I was trying to think what big creatures there were. So I thought, well, maybe a whale would be that big. And in fact, I went up to the National Museum, not with the bone, but with it in mind, and had a look at all the different creatures that were up there. And I thought, I think it must be something like a mammoth. So I then contacted Andrew, and that's when it was confirmed. So I didn't know it was a mammoth. I just knew it was very big. Thank you. I have a question here from online. So yes, the question is: can you age individuals from Loch Ryan?
In terms of how long ago they lived, or?
Yes, I think so. Yes.
Yeah. No. Yes, we will. We will have that information. Certainly, the femur we'll know before the end of the year, and the other one, the tooth, hopefully early next year.
And I'll have a supplementary question here. So you expect it to be about 30,000 years old?
Yeah, based on the other finds that have been dated so far in Scotland, yeah.
So what if it was much younger than that? Would that change the way we looked at the ice ages in the area?
Well, it would be very exciting. I'd probably jump up and down a bit. And well, if you think that the most recently recorded mammoth in Britain is 14,000 years ago, if we got anywhere near that, that would be great, because it would tell us that probably there was a contiguous population right stretching into Scotland. But...
Thank you. I have another question here from: would these mammoths have lived in Scotland?
Yes.
At all that time? Yes.
But not necessarily continuously, because obviously you saw that massive ice sheet, and of course most of Scotland was uninhabitable for things like woolly mammoths. So it's probably in the slightly warmer but still cool periods. Yeah.
Thank you. And another question here: what should we do if we do find a bone?
You could contact me. Well, I think there's two things. One of the critical things is that these bones are often found in wet conditions. Once they start drying out, they deteriorate very quickly. So try and keep it as moist as possible. So wrap it in wet cloth and put it in a poly bag or something like that. But just keep it wet until somebody can have a look at it, because once it starts drying out, it can start flaking and so on. And you might lose some of the key features on the bone which would help identify it. So
I think that's very helpful. Don't do what I did, which was I put it on a radiator.
No, that's a top tip. Don't put it on a radiator.
Another question here from online: what did mammoths feed on here in Loch Ryan?
Well, lots of grass. About 90% of their diet was probably grass. And then other kinds of plants that were growing in the mammoth steppe as well. So various herbs and sedges and things like that. And maybe dwarf trees like birch and willow and things like that.
And do we have any other questions in the room? Yes.
So I guess you did some field work from the area the bone was found. I mean, what sort of field work have you done in that area?
No, I haven't done it. I just wait for the bones to arrive.
So because they were actually, or the bone was actually right on the water's edge, so it wasn't in any ground or anything. Yeah. It had obviously been washing around. Probably people had walked past it numerous of times and just thought it was a piece of wood. Yeah. So because of that, we don't think that there's the rest of the mammoth there. That it's just something that's been washed out of the glacial till, probably. And so other than visiting that spot several times since to see if there was any more mammoth bones, done very little else.
Yeah. So I think it's just one of those really nice chance finds, you know. That's great. Yeah, very exciting.
All right, any more questions in the room? Yes.
So these are bones, not fossils.
Well, yeah, my paleontologist friends tell me if it's buried, it's fossil. So, but not mineralized like dinosaur bones. So they've still got protein, the collagen in them, and so they're still effectively bones. A lot of that protein will probably be washed out, but it's surprising how fresh some of them are. There's one of the brown bears that we radiocarbon dated from Inchadap. When I cut the bone to take the sample, it looked just like a fresh piece of bone. And it was, I thought, well, this could be really exciting, but it turned out to be 25,000 years old.
And that's way long enough to create fossilization.
Well, it's just the fact they're buried. Yeah.
So are there any other questions from the room? Yes.
Will you be able to tell if it lived around here? Like, will you be able to locate it within a certain area, given that you think it was just brought down glaciers or whatever? Will you be able to tell roughly?
Well, I don't know. Yeah. I could ask people who do stabilized to see if we can get any more of a location on it. But I guess you're just looking at which rivers are running down into Loch Ryan, and it's going to be from one of those. So it will be a local one, yeah, definitely.
So what are the interesting questions that you want to find out from this piece?
Well, I want to find out how old it is. I think that's a crucial piece because it just helps give us another bit of information about all those Ice Age mammals. And I guess if we can get some more information from stable isotopes about the diet and so on, that would be really exciting as well. I mean, I'm not expecting any surprises, but it'd just be nice to have that information.
Yeah. On a personal level?
Yeah, I just find it all very fascinating, and then I can come back and tell you again what we found out. Yeah, and the 13 woolly rhinos that you found since Cy was last here. Yeah. No, you never know. I mean, it's a great be to work at a place like National Museum of Scotland because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. You know, somebody says, I found a leopard skin in the attic, and then you find it's from their grandparents, and you know, and things like that. Extraordinary things people keep in their attics.
And we have one more question from online, which is asking, how did the bones in that bone cave, how did they arrive there? Why are they there?
Oh, right. What happened was in the 1880s, those caves were discovered as being bone-bearing caves. So they found things like lynx and brown bear and lemmings there. And then in 1926 and 1927, they had a major collecting expedition to those caves. And they just basically sifted through all the soil and other debris that are collected in the caves, and they recovered these thousands of bones. But there's still more in there. I mean, there's still more to be found. And then there's another system of caves behind the main caves that open out into the valley. And that's where some of these more recent brown bears come from. But again, there'll be loads of things in there, but it's just they're very inaccessible, and you have to be, you know, you have to be a caver really to get in there. You can't just wander in. It's hard work. So I think, for example, that bear skeleton, I think we knew it was there for something like at least 10 years, but we just couldn't get to it.
So why are the bones actually in that cave though? Is it that?
Well, again, a lot of it will be washed in, you know, from rivers and so on, but some of the bears were going into the caves to hibernate, which is why you get the more or less complete skeletons. And it being a limestone cave, it's got a high pH, and therefore that helps preserve the bone, so it's in much better condition than some of these things that are recovered from under peat bogs and so on, which are really quite fragile.
We have a message from Hugh Rose talking about why there were no mature bull reindeer antlers in the mix with the female and the young. And he says that mature males live separately from the rest of the herd for most of the year.
Yeah.
So not be present unless it was during the rut. And
Yeah,
also
they-
share their antlers.
Yeah, they've been on higher ground avoiding the biting flies, which would have been attacking the velvet on their antlers. Or so in more windy conditions, it's yeah.
And we've got one more question here, which I can partly answer. Is it too heavy to have come in on the tide? So I can confirm that it was very heavy, partly because it was hollow and completely packed with clay and stones. So it was actually, it was so heavy.
It's a lot lighter now.
Now it's dried out, so it won't have floated to the area.
Yeah, we've removed most of that interior filling. It's just there's still some on the inside which we still need to get out.
And we've got another comment here. We've got another comment here from Andrew Nicholson, who is the county archaeologist. He says there it's recently been found of a Paleolithic flint point from the Dunnagate Pass excavation. Previously, we thought that there was no Paleolithic archaeology in Dumfries and Galloway, so the dating of the mammoths will be interesting.
Yeah, no, that's very exciting. Yeah, good.
So what does that mean?
That's
means
before
that
the
there were people and
Ice Age human hunters around. Yes, which you might expect, but they're just it's the evidence like the fossils is very scant. So that's great to hear that. Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, I think we'll call that to an end. So thank you, Andrew, for everything that you've done. It's been really great hearing from you, and I'm sure we would like to give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
And maybe when we get those carbon dates, you'll come back and tell us more.
Yeah,
And we're very excited. I should say that the mammoth bone is likely to be loaned to Stranraer Museum at some point.
Yeah, well, hopefully we can do that, and possibly, the tooth as well. Why not? That would be great to do that.
And maybe with some other objects to give it some context, and we can all go and see it live down here. So again, thank you very much.
No, thank you.